A woman was executed in Huntsville tonight, just the 14th woman since the death penalty was reinstated in the 1970s. Suzanne Basso was convicted of torturing and killing Louis Buddy Musso in 1998.
On February 5, 2014, Suzanne Margaret Basso was wheeled into the death chamber at the Walls Unit in Huntsville, Texas. She was 59 years old. She had spent nearly 15 years on death row, waiting for this moment since her conviction in October 1999. In a few minutes, the state of Texas would execute her for the torture and murder of a mentally disabled man who had traveled halfway across the country because he believed she loved him. At 6:15 p.m. Central Time, prison officials began the lethal injection. A single dose of pentobarbital flowed through IV lines into her arms. The barbiturate would put her to sleep, then stop her breathing, then stop her heart. Witnesses watched through glass as the chemical did its work. Basso was dressed in a white prison uniform. She lay strapped to the gurney, arms extended. Before the injection began, the warden asked if she had any final statement. Her response was brief, "No, sir." She appeared to be holding back tears. She was breathing heavily. Then she looked through the window at her spiritual advisor. She managed a small smile. She mouthed a single word that witnesses thought was "bye." She nodded. As the pentobarbital took effect, Basso began to snore. The snoring grew quieter over the next several minutes. Then it stopped entirely. Her chest ceased rising and falling. At 6:26 p.m., 11 minutes after the injection began, a doctor checked for vital signs and found none. Suzanne Margaret Basso was pronounced dead. She was 59 years old, the same age as her victim, Louis Buddy Musso, had been when she killed him. Basso was the 14th woman executed in the United States since the Supreme Court reinstated capital punishment in 1976. She was the 5th woman executed in Texas since the state resumed executions in 1982. She was the 510th person overall to die in the Texas death chamber during that period, joining 505 men and 4 other women. Of all those executions, only a handful involved crimes as deliberately cruel as hers. She was the 2nd execution in Texas in 2014 and the first woman put to death in the entire country since Kimberly McCarthy 7 months earlier. Basso was executed for crimes that occurred more than 15 years earlier, in August 1998. A sweltering summer in Houston, Texas. The city sprawled across the Gulf Coast plains, humid and hot. In Jacinto City, a working-class suburb on the east side, life moved at its usual pace. Families struggled to make ends meet. Children played in the streets. And in a small, cluttered house, a 59-year-old mentally disabled man from New Jersey was being held prisoner by the woman he called his lady love. At some point during those August days, 6 people gathered in an apartment. They forced Buddy Musso to kneel on a children's playmat in the hallway. They beat him with baseball bats, belts, fists, and steel-toed boots. They burned him with cigarettes. They denied him food, water, and access to a bathroom. When he wet himself from deprivation and fear, they beat him for that too. For 5 days, the torture continued. 6 adults taking turns inflicting pain on a helpless man whose only crime was trusting the wrong person. A 300-pound woman jumping on him until his ribs broke. On August 25, 1998, Buddy Musso begged someone to call an ambulance. He knew he was dying. Instead of helping him, they put him in a bathtub filled with bleach, Comet, and Pine Sol. They scrubbed his broken body with a wire brush. He died during this bath. His system finally giving out from 5 days of unimaginable cruelty. They dressed his corpse in clean clothes, one shoe on the wrong foot. They dumped him in a ditch in Galena Park. They went back to their lives as if nothing had happened. The motive was money. Sue Basso had taken out life insurance policies on Buddy worth $65,000 if he died violently. She had created a fake will, leaving everything to her. She had lured him from New Jersey with promises of marriage, isolated him from everyone who loved him, and then tortured him to death for an insurance payout she would never collect. On paper, Suzanne Basso was a monster, a manipulative predator who targeted a vulnerable man and organized a group of followers to help her destroy him. The prosecutors called her calculating. They said she knew exactly what she was doing. They said she enjoyed it. But there was another story beneath the surface. A story of a girl born into a family shadowed by violence, the niece of a serial killer. A girl who grew up to become exactly what her environment had created. None of that excuses what she did. Nothing can excuse torturing a gentle, trusting man to death for insurance money. But it helps explain how a person becomes capable of such horror. It helps explain how a woman could organize 5 other people to slowly destroy a man who loved her. This is not just a story about murder. This is the story of Suzanne Basso and Louis Buddy Musso. This is a story with no way out. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. On May 15, 1954, in the industrial city of Schenectady, New York, Suzanne Margaret Burns entered a world that would shape her into one of the most manipulative killers in Texas history. She was born into a large working-class family, the youngest of 3 daughters among 8 children. Her parents, Florence Garrow Burns and John Richard Burns, struggled to provide for their growing household in the factories and mills that defined upstate New York life. But there was something darker in the Burns family tree. Florence Burns was the elder sister of Robert Garrow, a man who would become one of New York's most notorious criminals. In 1973, Robert Garrow embarked on an 18-day killing spree through the Adirondack Mountains, stabbing 4 people to death and committing multiple rapes before his capture. His criminal trial became a landmark case in legal ethics, known as the Buried Bodies case, when his attorneys refused to reveal the locations of 2 victims' bodies, citing attorney-client privilege. Garrow was shot dead while attempting to escape from prison in 1978. His violence cast a long shadow over the Burns family. Whether genetics or environment played the greater role, the capacity for cruelty seemed to run in the bloodline. Suzanne Burns would eventually prove this theory correct in the most horrifying way imaginable. The Burns household was not a safe place for children. Suzanne experienced both physical and sexual abuse during her formative years. One family's story, repeated among relatives for decades, described what happened when Florence Burns caught young Suzanne with a pack of cigarettes. Instead of making her smoke them as punishment, Florence forced the child to eat them. This was the kind of cruelty that defined daily life in the Burns home. As a teenager, Suzanne fell into a pattern of delinquency. She skipped school regularly. She engaged in sexual activity at a young age. She stole. Her behavior became so problematic that her parents sent her to a Catholic boarding school in Albany, hoping the nuns could straighten her out. Despite later claims of extensive European education and convent training, Suzanne Burns never attended college. She never traveled to Europe. The only genuine skill she developed was sewing. She became an accomplished seamstress, capable of creating beautiful garments with her own hands. But fabric and thread could not contain the damage that had been done. The abuse Suzanne suffered as a child did not make her compassionate toward others who were vulnerable. Instead, it taught her how to identify weakness and exploit it. She learned that power came from control, and control came from fear. These lessons would follow her throughout her life, leaving a trail of victims in her wake. By her late teens, Suzanne Burns was ready to leave Schenectady behind. She had no interest in factory work or small-town life. She wanted something more, something bigger. She wanted to reinvent herself. The young woman who left New York was already skilled at deception, already practiced in the art of manipulation. She just needed the right opportunity to put those skills to work. James David Peake was a United States Marine when he met Suzanne Burns in the early 1970s. He came from a working-class background similar to hers, a young man looking for structure and purpose in the military. They met and married in April 1972. Suzanne Burns became Sue Peake. She was 18 years old, eager to escape her past in Schenectady, and convinced that marriage to a Marine would give her the fresh start she craved. She stood only 5 feet 2 inches tall, but what she lacked in physical stature she made up for in force of personality. The marriage was troubled from the beginning. James Peake was himself a troubled individual, and he tolerated behaviors from his wife that most husbands would not accept. Sue was sexually promiscuous throughout the marriage, bringing other men into their lives with her husband's knowledge. Whether James accepted this out of weakness, indifference, or his own psychological damage remains unclear. What is certain is that the Peake household was dysfunctional from the start. The couple's first child, a daughter named Mary Ann Margaret Peake, was born in June 1973 in Saratoga, New York. Their son, Harold John Peake, followed in September 1974. To the outside world, the Peakes appeared to be a normal young military family. James served his country. Suzanne kept house and cared for the children. Family photographs from this period show two young children standing rigidly, posed like little soldiers. Harold was frequently dressed in military clothing, something his mother encouraged from his earliest years. But behind closed doors, the reality was far different. The Peake home was a place of chaos, abuse, and exploitation. Both parents participated in creating an environment that would scar their children for life. When Mary Ann was 5 years old, the family left New York. James Peake had completed his service in the Marines and now supported his family by working a series of jobs. They moved to North Carolina, where the abuse that had begun in New York continued without interruption. The children had no escape. They were too young to understand that what was happening to them was wrong, too isolated to seek help from outsiders. By the late 1970s, the Peake family had relocated again, this time to Houston, Texas. The move did nothing to improve their circumstances. If anything, being far from extended family and old neighbors gave Sue and James even more freedom to abuse their children without interference. Years later, Mary Ann, who would eventually take the name Christiana Hardy, described a childhood of relentless abuse. Sue Peake subjected her wards to physical beatings, emotional torment, and sexual exploitation. The abuse began when the children were very young and continued throughout their formative years. There was no safe space in the Peake household, no adult who could be trusted, no moment when the children could let down their guard. Christiana's earliest memories included watching her mother bring strange men into their home and have sex with them while her husband and children were present. This happened repeatedly throughout her childhood. Sue made no effort to hide her activities from her children. On one occasion, when the family still lived in New York, Sue took her children to a stranger's house. Christiana and her brother sat at the kitchen table while their mother had sex with a man in the next room. The young girl remembered feeling embarrassed and confused, unable to understand why her mother would do such things. The sexual abuse was even more. In Houston, in a motel room, Christiana was sexually abused for the first time by her father. James Peake called his daughter into his room after he had finished having sex with Sue. What happened next would haunt Christiana for the rest of her life. Her own father, the man who was supposed to protect her, became her abuser, and her mother, who was present, did nothing to stop it. But far worse was still to come. When Christiana was 7 years old, maintenance workers came to the family's small Houston apartment to make repairs. Sue Peake forced both children to undress in front of the workers. Then she offered her naked children to the men as sexual playthings. One of the maintenance men fondled Christiana while Sue watched with apparent amusement. The worker stopped before going further, but the psychological damage was profound and permanent. She told them they could do anything they wanted to us, Christiana recalled decades later, her voice still carrying the weight of that trauma. I don't know why she did it. For amusement, I guess. This incident crystallized something important about Sue Peake's character. She did not abuse them out of uncontrollable rage or under the influence of drugs or alcohol. She did it deliberately, calculatingly for her own entertainment. She enjoyed having power over helpless victims. She enjoyed watching others suffer. This was not a woman who lost control. This was a woman who exercised control in the most twisted ways imaginable. The household operated under a strange combination of chaos and rigid control. Sue and James Peake forced their children to march like soldiers, stand at attention, and sing the Marine Corps hymn on command. James brought his military training home, but perverted it into a tool of abuse rather than discipline. In 1982, the Peake family's dysfunction finally came to public attention. James Peake was arrested for molesting. The abuse that had been hidden behind closed doors was now exposed to the legal system. He was convicted, a crime that carried serious consequences. The conviction should have ended Sue Peake's influence. Instead, it only complicated an already broken family. Sue was never charged with any crime. Despite her role in enabling and participating in the abuse, she managed to present herself as a victim of her husband's actions rather than his willing partner. With James Peake facing legal consequences, Sue gave up custody of her children. Mary Ann and Harold were separated from each other and shuffled between foster homes and various relatives. The stability they had never known at home remained elusive. They were damaged children carrying trauma that foster parents and social workers could not easily address. Sue would see her children occasionally during these years, sending gifts and cards, playing the role of the loving mother from a distance. She never admitted responsibility for what had happened to them. She never apologized. She simply maintained enough contact to keep her hooks in her victims, ensuring that they could never fully escape her influence. The children grew up damaged in different ways. Mary Ann developed enough independence to join the Marines at 18, seeking the structure her chaotic childhood had lacked. Harold took a different path. He remained tethered to his mother, unable to break free from her psychological grip. When he was 16, he drifted back to Texas to live with his parents once again. Sue welcomed her son's return. She had plans for Harold, and those plans did not include his independence or his well-being. The transformation began with a name. In the early 1990s, Sue Peake gathered her reunited family in their Houston residence and announced that they would no longer be the Peakes. From that day forward, they would be the O'Malleys. She claimed this change was stipulated in the will of a deceased family member who had left them an inheritance. The family had to adopt the O'Malley surname to receive the money. Relatives who heard this story later said it was almost certainly a lie. There was no inheritance. There was no wealthy relative. There was only Sue's desire to reinvent herself once again, to shed her old identity like a snake shedding its skin. The Peake name carried too much baggage. James Peake's conviction for molestation was a matter of public record. The O'Malley name offered a fresh start, a clean slate, a chance to pretend the past had never happened. Harold John Peake became James David O'Malley Jr., known to everyone as J.D. His father, James David Peake, presumably became James David O'Malley Sr., though he would fade increasingly into the background as Sue took center stage. The family adopted an Irish-American identity, despite having no verified Irish heritage. Sue decorated their lives with shamrocks and Celtic symbols, embracing this fictional ancestry with the same enthusiasm she brought to all her lies. Mary Ann, who was 18 and serving in the Marines when the name change occurred, came to visit her mother on leave. What she found in Houston shocked her. The brother she remembered from childhood had become a different person entirely. He was violent. He was angry. Mary Ann later said. She had spent her life molding him. She turned him into what he became. He was her personal servant, and she made money off him by receiving his disability benefits. She had turned him into a lethal weapon. J.D. O'Malley lived a fantasy life as a special operations soldier. He wore military regalia day and night, never changing into civilian clothes, even sleeping in his fatigues. His mother refused to buy him regular clothing, encouraging his paramilitary delusions at every turn. He collected weapons. He practiced combat maneuvers. He followed his mother's orders with the unquestioning obedience of a trained soldier following a commanding officer. But J.D. had never served in the military. His combat experience existed only in his imagination. Sue had created an elaborate fantasy world for her son, one where he was a warrior, a protector, a man of action. In reality, he was none of these things. He was a damaged young man, controlled completely by his mother, unable to function independently in the adult world. Sue controlled every aspect of her son's existence. She managed his money, his schedule, and his relationships. There were whispers among those who knew the family that the relationship between mother and son went beyond normal family bonds. Some suspected a sexual component to their connection. Whatever the exact nature of their relationship, JD was completely dependent on his mother and would do anything she asked. Christiana's visit to Texas brought her briefly back into her mother's orbit. Sue introduced her daughter to a man named Scott Hardy, and the two had a whirlwind courtship that resulted in marriage. Christiana would later say that introducing her to Scott was the only good thing her mother ever did for her. But Sue also tried to pull her daughter back under her control. She bullied Christiana into leaving the Marine Corps, using the same psychological tactics she had employed throughout her daughter's childhood. She attempted to involve Christiana in various schemes and money-making ventures. Christiana resisted. She had seen enough. She understood now, as an adult, that her mother was dangerous. Meanwhile, Sue had already found a new source of income and entertainment. While Christiana was pulling away, Sue was pulling someone else closer. His name was Carmine Basso. He was a businessman from New Jersey who had fallen under Sue's spell, and he would give her the surname she would carry all the way to the execution chamber. Carmine Joseph Basso was 43 years old when he met Sue Peak in 1993. He owned a small company called Latin Security and Investigations Corporation, operating out of an office in Southwest Houston. He was a businessman, not a wealthy one, but comfortable enough. He had no idea what he was getting himself into. Sue was still legally married to James Peak. She had never bothered to file for divorce despite years of living separate lives. But marriage certificates meant nothing to Sue. She began a romantic relationship with Carmine while her husband still lived under the same roof. The arrangement was unusual, to say the least. For a time, all of them coexisted in the same Houston residence. Sue, her legal husband James Peak, her boyfriend Carmine Basso, and her son J.D. O'Malley. James Peak apparently accepted this situation without protest. He had tolerated Sue's infidelities throughout their marriage, and this was simply the latest in a long line of humiliations. Eventually, James moved to another residence in Houston, but he remained legally married to Sue and continued to stand by her. Whether James Peak truly loved Sue or was simply incapable of breaking free from her control remains an open question. Sue could not legally marry Carmine because she had never divorced James. But legal obstacles had never stopped her before. She simply changed her name to Basso and began referring to Carmine as her husband. In her mind, saying something made it true. She began working at Latin Security and Investigations, learning the security business while building yet another new identity. Carmine Basso had no idea that the woman he loved was a predator. He did not know about her family connection to serial killer Robert Garrow. He did not know about the abuse she had inflicted on her children. He did not know that she had a pattern of attaching herself to vulnerable people and draining them of everything they had. By the time he might have figured it out, it was already too late. On October 22, 1995, a quarter-page engagement announcement appeared in the Houston Chronicle that would become infamous for its audacity. The bride was identified as Suzanne Margaret Ann Cassandra Lynn Teresa Marie Mary Veronica Sue Burns Stanlins Lowski. According to the announcement, she was one of 12 children and heiress to an oil dynasty in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She had obtained a degree in home economics and trade sewing from St. Anne's Institute in Yorkshire, England. She had been an accomplished gymnast. She had even served as a nun, taking the name Sister Mary Theresa. The groom, Carmine Joseph John Basso, was described as a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient from the Vietnam War. Almost none of this was true. Sue was not one of 12 children. She was not an heiress to any fortune. She had never studied in England. She had never been a gymnast. Officials at the convents mentioned in the announcement told reporters they had never heard of her. Carmine Basso had no Congressional Medal of Honor on record. The Houston Chronicle did not receive payment for the advertisement, which was priced at $3,372. 3 days after it appeared, the newspaper retracted the announcement, stating it was investigating possible inaccuracies. The whole episode revealed Sue Basso's compulsion to create elaborate fictions about herself, even when those fictions were easily disprovable. On May 27, 1997, Sue Basso called the Houston Police Department with a concern. She had not spoken to Carmine for a week and was worried about his well-being. She asked police to check on him at his office. Officer J.R. Martinez went to the office of Latin Security and Investigations Corporation. Inside, he found Carmine Basso dead. He was 47 years old. The scene was disturbing. The office had no restroom facilities, and there were several trash cans containing human feces and urine. The space was so dirty and foul-smelling that cleaning staff for the building had refused to enter. The medical examiner's report noted that Carmine's body showed signs of malnourishment and had a strong ammonia odor. The cause of death was determined to be erosion of the esophagus due to regurgitation of stomach acid. It was ruled natural causes, but Carmine's family had their doubts, and soon, investigators would have reason to take a second look. After Carmine Basso's death, Sue took over his security business and continued building her life in the Houston area. She and J.D. lived in a small house in Jacinto City, a working-class suburb on the east side of Houston. The house was cramped and cluttered, home to Sue, J.D., a dog, a cat, and 2 ferrets. During this period, Sue formed a connection with another family that would become central to the tragedy ahead. Bernice Aarons Miller was a 54-year-old woman who lived in an apartment with her 2 adult children, Craig, 25, and Hope, 22. Hope was engaged to Terrence Jermaine Singleton, 27, who also lived in the apartment. The Aarons family occupied a lower rung on the social ladder. They were not educated people. They were not ambitious people. They were the kind of folks who drifted through life following the lead of anyone who seemed to have a plan. And Sue Basso always had a plan. How exactly Sue came to dominate this group is unclear. What is known is that by 1998, the Aarons family treated her as an authority figure. They followed her instructions. They participated in her schemes. They were afraid to say no to her. Bernice Aarons was a weak-willed woman who had raised 2 children without instilling in them any sense of moral boundaries. Craig Aarons was a follower, someone who did what he was told without asking questions. Hope Aarons was young and impressionable, engaged to Singleton but still living under her mother's roof and her mother's influence. Terrence Singleton was perhaps the most physically capable of the group. He was young, strong, and connected to the family through his engagement to Hope. Like the others, he deferred to Sue Basso when she gave orders. Together with J.D. O'Malley, these 5 people formed a circle around Sue Basso. They were her soldiers, her tools, her accomplices in waiting. They did not question her authority. They did not challenge her decisions. When she told them to do something, they did it. By the spring of 1997, Sue Basso was ready to find her next victim. She knew exactly what she was looking for. Someone lonely, someone trusting, someone with a steady income, and few people watching out for them. She found all of these qualities in a mentally disabled man from New Jersey named Louis Musso. Everyone called him Buddy. Louis Charles Musso was born in 1939 and grew up to be the kind of person that neighbors describe as sweet. He had an intellectual disability that limited his mental capacity to roughly that of a 7 to 10-year-old child. But within his limitations, he lived a full and independent life. As a young man, Buddy Musso got married. He and his wife had a son they named Tony. For a few years, Buddy experienced the family life he had always wanted. He was a devoted husband and a loving father. He found joy in simple pleasures and in the people he cared about. Then tragedy struck. In 1980, Buddy's wife died of cancer, just 2 years after giving birth to Tony. The loss devastated him. He had been a husband, and now he was a widower. He had known love, and now he was alone. For the next 17 years, Buddy Musso lived a quiet life in Cliffside Park, New Jersey, just across the Hudson River from Upper Manhattan. He resided in an assisted living facility where staff and fellow residents looked out for him. He worked as a grocery bagger at ShopRite, earning his own money and maintaining his independence. Buddy had a friend named Al Becker who had known him for 20 years. Becker served as Buddy's Social Security representative payee, managing his benefits and helping him navigate the complexities of adult life. It was a responsibility Becker took seriously. He cared about Buddy and wanted to protect him from those who might take advantage of his trusting nature. At the assisted living facility, Buddy was well liked. He had a booming laugh that could fill a room. He loved to sing, especially country western songs he learned from the radio. His renditions were slightly off-key, but no one minded. He dreamed of being a cowboy singer someday. If you gave him a little bit of attention, he became very attached to you. This was both Buddy's greatest strength and his fatal weakness. He craved connection. He longed for the family he had lost when his wife died. He wanted someone to love him, someone to care for him, someone to grow old with. After 17 years of loneliness, he was desperate for that kind of bond. In the spring of 1997, a church bazaar was held near the assisted living facility where Buddy lived. Among the visitors was a heavyset woman from Texas who introduced herself as Sue Basso. She was friendly, she was attentive. She seemed to find Buddy charming and interesting. Buddy Musso, lonely for so long, had finally found his lady love. The long-distance relationship between Buddy Musso and Sue Basso developed quickly. After their meeting at the church bazaar, they began talking on the phone regularly. Buddy would emerge from these conversations blushing like a teenager, eager to tell anyone who would listen about the wonderful woman in Texas. He called her, "My Lady Love." Sue was 15 years younger than Buddy and weighed over 300 pounds. At 44, she was still legally married to James Peake, still grieving the death of Carmine Basso, and still running schemes to extract money from vulnerable people. But Buddy saw none of this. He saw only a woman who paid attention to him, who made him feel special, who promised him the family he had been missing for almost 2 decades. Within months of their meeting, Buddy was making plans to move to Texas. He would leave behind his job at ShopRite, his friends at the assisted living facility, his church community, and everyone who had looked out for him for years. He would travel halfway across the country to be with a woman he had only just met. The people who knew Buddy were concerned. Gene Albanese and other neighbors asked questions about this Sue Basso. Why was she so eager for a mentally disabled man to move to Texas? What did she really want from him? The situation felt wrong, but Buddy would not listen to warnings. His son Tony tried to caution him. "Listen, Dad, you have to be careful," Tony told his father. But Buddy was in love, and love made him blind to danger. Al Becker, who had managed Buddy's finances for 20 years, watched the situation unfold with growing alarm. He knew how vulnerable Buddy was to manipulation. He knew that there were people in the world who preyed on men like him. But short of physically restraining Buddy, there was little he could do to stop what was happening. Buddy began shipping his belongings to Sue's address in Jacinto City. His possessions were modest, but they represented everything he had. He used money from his Social Security check to buy an engagement ring. He planned the wedding reception that would take place at the Cliffside Park Legion Hall. He bought a new set of Western clothes for the journey: pointy-toed cowboy boots, a neckerchief, and a brand-new cowboy hat. On June 14, 1998, Buddy Musso said goodbye to his friends and community. He told them to prepare for the big wedding celebration. He boarded a Greyhound bus headed for Houston, dressed in his cowboy gear and carrying dreams of the life that awaited him. The journey from New Jersey to Texas took more than a day. Buddy watched the American landscape roll by outside his window, probably imagining the happiness that lay ahead. He had no way of knowing that he had just over 2 months left to live. In Jacinto City, Sue Basso was waiting. She had plans for Buddy Musso, but marriage was not among them. When Buddy Musso arrived at Sue Basso's home in Jacinto City, the reality of his situation quickly became apparent. The house was small and cluttered. He was given a cot in the living room to sleep on, while J.D. O'Malley slept on a mattress nearby. Sue's son watched Buddy constantly, and Buddy watched back, probably sensing that something was not right. Sue immediately began her campaign to isolate Buddy from everyone who cared about him. When Al Becker called to check on his friend, Sue would not let them speak. She made excuses at first, then became more aggressive in blocking contact. Becker tried calling multiple times, but Sue either refused to put Buddy on the phone or claimed he was unavailable. Concerned about Buddy's welfare, Becker contacted various Texas state agencies for help. He tried Adult Protective Services. He tried local authorities. But without evidence of a crime, there was little anyone could do. Sue Basso had Buddy right where she wanted him, isolated from his support network and completely dependent on her. In July 1998, Sue attempted to have herself designated as Buddy's Social Security representative payee. This would give her direct control over his monthly benefit checks. The Social Security Administration denied her request, but she had other ways to profit from her victim. Sue obtained life insurance policies on Buddy Musso, with herself named as the sole beneficiary. One policy provided a base payout of $15,000, but there was a clause that increased the payment to $65,000 if Buddy died as the result of a violent crime. On August 13, 1998, Sue created a document on her computer that she titled Last Will and Testament. It was dated 1997, backdated to make it appear legitimate. The document left Buddy's entire estate to Sue Basso, specifying that no one else was to get a cent. J.D. O'Malley, Terrence Singleton, and Bernice Aarons signed as witnesses. Sue also created a fake restraining order on her computer that barred any of Buddy's relatives from contacting him. She was building a paper trail that would support her claims after his death, while simultaneously ensuring that no one could interfere with her plans. From the moment he arrived in Texas, Buddy Musso was treated like a slave. Sue and J.D. forced him to do chores around the house. When he moved too slowly or failed to complete a task to their satisfaction, they beat him. The abuse started almost immediately and escalated rapidly. Buddy had traveled halfway across the country seeking love and family. Instead, he found himself trapped in a house with people who saw him only as a source of income and an object for their cruelty. He was far from everyone who had ever protected him, surrounded by strangers who wished him harm. And the worst was yet to come. If you're watching this far, you're clearly invested in understanding this case. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the conclusion of this story. Now, let's continue. By August 1998, Buddy Musso had been in Texas for about 2 months, and the abuse he suffered was becoming visible. He had lost 25 to 30 pounds from his already thin frame. He walked with difficulty. He had bruises that he could not explain to outsiders. Somewhere in the midst of his ordeal, Buddy managed to write a note. He addressed it to a friend back in New Jersey, a desperate plea from a man who had realized too late the danger he was in. The note read, "You must get someone down here and get me out of here. I want to come back to New Jersey soon." He hid the note in a pair of his pants, hoping somehow to get it to someone who could help. But Buddy was watched constantly. He had no access to stamps or mailboxes. He had no phone privileges. The note remained hidden. On August 22, 1998, a Houston police officer named Jeff Butcher received a report of an assault on the east side of town near Jacinto City. When he arrived at the scene, he found an unusual sight. 2 young men were leading an older man around in what Butcher described as a military-style run. The young men were J.D. O'Malley, 23, and Terrence Singleton, 27. The older man was Buddy Musso. He had 2 black eyes and was visibly exhausted. He complained to the officer that he did not want to run anymore. When Butcher asked Buddy about his injuries, Buddy claimed that 3 Mexican men had beaten him up while he was out for a walk. This was a lie, but Buddy may have been too frightened to tell the truth with his abusers standing right there. He had learned by now what happened when he displeased Sue Basso. Speaking to a police officer without her permission would bring consequences he did not want to imagine. Officer Butcher drove the 3 men to a nearby apartment where Singleton lived with his fiancée, Hope Aarons, her mother Bernice, and her brother Craig. There he found Sue Basso, who identified herself as Buddy's legal guardian. Sue put on a performance for the officer. She scolded J.D. for making Buddy run, her voice full of concern and disapproval. She comforted Buddy in front of the policeman, stroking his arm and speaking to him softly, acting the part of a caring guardian who was concerned about her ward's welfare. The transformation was seamless. The woman who had been beating Buddy for weeks became, in an instant, his loving protector. Officer Butcher accepted this at face value. He saw what Sue wanted him to see. A concerned caretaker dealing with an overzealous young man who had pushed a disabled person too hard. He left the scene without taking further action. He filed his report and moved on to the next call. He had no way of knowing that he had just witnessed a murder in progress. The Aaron's apartment became Buddy Musso's final prison. Buddy already had 2 black eyes from earlier beatings. Inside, Sue ordered Buddy to stay on a red and blue children's playmat in the hallway. It was the kind of mat designed for toddlers to play on, decorated with bright colors and cheerful patterns. Now it would serve as Buddy's designated spot, the place where he would spend most of his remaining hours on Earth. He was forced to remain in position, sometimes on his hands and knees like an animal, sometimes just kneeling with his hands behind his neck. If he tried to move from the mat, he was beaten. If he cried out, he was beaten. If he asked for food or water or permission to use the bathroom, he was beaten. The abuse that followed lasted 5 days. It involved all 6 members of the group. It was systematic, sustained, and savage. What happened in that apartment defied comprehension. 6 adults, working together, slowly destroyed a helpless man whose only crime was trusting the wrong person. Sue Basso, who weighed over 300 pounds at the time, would repeatedly jump on Buddy while he was on his hands and knees. Her weight crushed him, breaking his ribs and causing him to collapse flat on the ground. She'd beat him with a baseball bat, targeting his back, buttocks, and groin. She struck him with a belt. She hit him with a vacuum cleaner attachment. J.D. O'Malley kicked Buddy repeatedly while wearing steel-toed combat boots. At one point, Buddy begged him to stop. J.D. paused, and Sue immediately demanded to know why he had stopped. The message was clear. The beating would continue until Sue said otherwise. Terrence Singleton kicked Buddy and beat him with a baseball bat. Craig Aarons joined in, using the bat and a vacuum hose. Bernice Aarons hit Buddy as well. Even Hope Aarons participated. Throughout the ordeal, Buddy was denied food and water. He was not allowed to use the bathroom. When he wet himself from the deprivation and fear, he was beaten for that too. He was frequently handcuffed, both at the apartment and in the back seat of a car when the group went out to eat at restaurants. While his tormentors enjoyed their meals, Buddy sat restrained in the vehicle, injured and starving. When Sue went to work, she instructed J.D. to watch the others and make sure they did not leave the apartment or use the phone. She maintained control even when she was not physically present. The others followed her orders without question. They burned Buddy with cigarettes. They whipped him with belts. They stomped on him with heavy boots. By Tuesday, August 25th, Buddy Musso had endured 5 days of continuous torture. His body was covered with hundreds of bruises. And then Sue Basso decided it was time to finish what they had started. On the evening of Tuesday, August 25th, 1998, Buddy Musso received his most severe beating yet. Sue Basso jumped on him repeatedly while he was on all fours, crushing him with her 300-pound weight. The others joined in, kicking and striking him until his body gave out. Buddy asked someone to call an ambulance. He knew he was dying. He begged for medical help, for mercy, for someone to stop what was happening. His pleas fell on deaf ears. Instead of calling for help, the group decided to give Buddy a bath. They dragged his broken body to the bathroom and placed him in the bathtub. Then they filled the tub with a mixture of bleach, Comet cleaning powder, and Pine Sol disinfectant. The chemical solution burned Buddy's skin on contact. J.D. O'Malley used a wire brush to scrub Buddy's skin. The bristles tore at flesh that was already covered with cuts, bruises, and burns. The chemicals seeped into every wound. Buddy Musso died during this bath, his body finally giving out from the accumulated trauma of 5 days of torture. With Buddy dead, the group faced the problem of disposing of his body. Sue Basso suggested they use Bernice Aarons' car. Bernice recommended placing the body in the trunk. They cleaned Buddy up as best they could, dressing him in fresh clothes. One shoe was placed on the wrong foot. The other foot was left shoeless. They drove to Galena Park, a suburb adjacent to Jacinto City. They found a ditch along the 2100 block of North Main Street. It was a scruffy area, not frequently traveled. They dumped Buddy's body in the ditch and drove away. Then they returned to their lives as if nothing had happened. Sue went back to her house. The Aarons family went back to their apartment. They had murdered a man together, a helpless, mentally disabled man who had come to Texas looking for love, and they felt no apparent remorse. 3 days later, Sue Basso made a series of phone calls. She contacted Buddy's niece. She called local police. In each conversation, she expressed concern about Buddy's whereabouts. She claimed that he had disappeared, that he had run off with a little Mexican lady from a laundromat. She filed a missing person report with the Jacinto City Police Department. She was setting up her alibi, preparing the story she would tell when authorities came asking questions. But on the morning of August 26, a jogger made a discovery that would unravel everything. The morning of August 26, 1998, began like any other for a jogger making his routine run through Galena Park. Around 8:30 a.m., he noticed something unusual in a ditch along North Main Street. At first, he could not quite identify what he was seeing. He moved closer and realized it was a human body. He called the police. Officer Kevin Cates of the Galena Park Police Department was one of the first to arrive at the scene. He confirmed that the victim was dead and immediately noticed something odd about the body. Despite being covered in blood and horrific bruises, the corpse was dressed in clean clothes. This told Cates that the victim had been killed elsewhere and brought to this location after death. Assistant Chief Robert Pruitt arrived shortly after Cates. He surveyed the scene and began thinking about how to identify the victim, who carried no identification. Pruitt had a dispatcher check with neighboring cities for any recent missing person reports. Jacinto City, which bordered Galena Park, reported that a woman named Suzanne Basso had recently filed a missing person report. The missing person was a mentally disabled man named Louis Buddy Musso. Pruitt decided to visit Basso's address to gather more information. When he arrived, Basso was not home. She had gone to the Jacinto City Police Department to provide an identification card belonging to Musso, apparently adding details to the missing person report she had filed. A few minutes later, Basso returned to her house. Pruitt was waiting. He introduced himself, and Basso invited him inside the small, cluttered home she shared with her son, her pets, and until recently, Buddy Musso. Inside, Pruitt noticed a cot in the living room where Musso had slept. Near the cot were bloody clothing and a bloody sheet. Sue Basso explained that these belonged to Musso. She did not seem concerned about the blood. Pruitt asked Sue Basso and her son J.D. O'Malley to accompany him to view the body that had been found. Perhaps they could identify whether it was the missing Musso. Both agreed. When they arrived at the scene, J.D. O'Malley got out of the car. He walked toward the body in the ditch. Without displaying any sign of surprise or emotion, he positively identified the corpse as Buddy Musso. His lack of reaction was telling. A normal person would be shocked, horrified, or at least saddened to discover that someone they knew had been murdered. J.D. showed nothing. He had known exactly what he would find because he had helped put the body there. Pruitt then asked both Sue Basso and J.D. O'Malley to come to the police station to give written statements. They agreed. At the station, Pruitt made a decision that would break the case wide open. He separated mother and son. He took J.D. aside, away from his mother's influence, and asked him directly what had happened. J.D. O'Malley's response was immediate and damning. "We killed him." Once J.D. O'Malley started talking, he could not stop. Separated from his mother for perhaps the first time in his adult life, he told police everything. He described the beatings, the torture, the 5 days of horror that Buddy Musso had endured. He named the other participants: his mother Sue, Bernice Aarons, Craig Aarons, Hope Aarons, and Terrence Singleton. O'Malley directed police to a dumpster where they had disposed of evidence. Inside, officers found a garbage bag containing blood-stained clothes that Musso had been wearing during the torture, plastic gloves used during the disposal of the body, blood-stained towels, and other incriminating items. Sue Basso also provided a written confession, though she attempted to deflect blame onto the others. She admitted knowing that her son and the Aarons group had beaten and abused Musso for at least a full day before his death. She admitted that she had also beaten Musso. She admitted driving Bernice Aarons's car, with Musso's body in the trunk, to the site where he was dumped. She admitted disposing of the bloody evidence. Police went to the Aarons apartment. When they knocked on the door and Bernice Aarons answered, the first words out of her mouth were, "This is about Buddy, isn't it?" Inside the apartment, officers collected a wooden baseball bat, an aluminum baseball bat, handcuffs, and pieces of blood-stained carpet from the hallway where Musso had been forced to kneel on the mat. They also took samples from the carpet in the trunk of Bernice Aarons's car. Laboratory tests confirmed what the confessions had revealed. There was blood on the hallway carpet. There was blood and hair on the wooden bat. There was blood on the aluminum bat. There was blood on the car bumper. Nearly everything recovered from the dumpster tested positive for blood. All 6 suspects were arrested and charged with capital murder. Bernice Aarons and Craig Aarons gave voluntary statements describing their roles in the killing. Their accounts matched O'Malley's in most significant details. The autopsy of Buddy Musso painted a comprehensive picture of his suffering. The medical examiner documented hundreds of bruises covering his body from head to toe. There were contusions and abrasions on his face, chest, abdomen, genitals, arms, hands, and feet. Even the palms of his hands and the soles of his feet were bruised. His skull was fractured in what the examiner called a hinge fracture, caused by massive trauma to the head. He had received 18 or 19 separate blows to the head, leaving a large X-shaped laceration. His nose was broken. He had 14 broken ribs. He had 2 dislocated vertebrae and a bone fracture in his neck. His back and buttocks showed approximately 30 lash marks and what appeared to be cigarette burns. The official cause of death was determined to be multiple blunt impact trauma, with the skull fracture identified as the likely fatal injury. The medical examiner noted that the injuries had been inflicted over a period of approximately 5 days. One investigator summarized the findings bluntly. The victim's body was so horrendous that he was unrecognizable. As investigators pieced together what had happened to Buddy Musso, one thing became clear. Sue Basso was the driving force behind everything. She had found the victim. She had lured him to Texas. She had isolated him from everyone who might have helped him. She had obtained the insurance policies and created the fake documents. She had organized the group that carried out the torture. She had participated directly in the beatings. She had directed the disposal of the body and evidence. Suzanne ran the show for sure, prosecutor Colleen Barnett would later say. She was the one in charge. She directed them. She wanted the money. She's a heinous killer. The motive was financial. Sue had taken out life insurance policies on Buddy worth up to $65,000 if he died violently. She had created a fake will, leaving his estate to her. She had attempted to become his Social Security representative payee. Every action she took was designed to extract money from a vulnerable man who trusted her. But the killing also served another purpose. Sue Basso enjoyed causing pain. She had abused her own children throughout their childhoods. She had treated her son J.D. as a personal servant, and possibly worse. She had likely played a role in the suspicious death of Carmine Basso, though that would never be proven. Hurting people was not just a means to an end for Sue Basso, it was a source of satisfaction. The other 5 defendants were followers, not leaders. They participated in the torture because Sue told them to. Some, like J.D., had been conditioned from birth to obey her. Others, like the Aarons family, seemed to lack the moral backbone to refuse. Singleton went along because Hope went along, and Hope went along because her mother went along. When the case went public, news reports initially focused on a detail that seemed to trivialize the horror of what had happened. Headlines proclaimed that 6 people had killed a man over a broken Mickey Mouse ornament. This was based on Hope Aarons's admission that she had hit Buddy because he broke one of her figurines. But the Mickey Mouse story was not the real motive. It was an excuse, a justification offered by one participant for her role in the crime. The real motive was Sue Basso's greed and cruelty. The ornament was merely a pretext for violence that was going to happen regardless. Harris County District Attorney's Office decided to seek the death penalty against Sue Basso. She was the mastermind, the organizer, the one who had set everything in motion. The other 5 defendants would face serious charges, but only Sue would face execution. Texas District Judge Mary Lou Keel ordered separate trials for each defendant. This would allow prosecutors to use the testimony of those who pleaded guilty or were convicted first against those who were tried later. It was a strategic decision that would prove crucial in bringing Sue Basso to justice. The trials were scheduled to begin in the spring of 1999. Prosecutors Colleen Barnett and Denise Nassar prepared to present their case to juries who would hear the full, horrible truth of what had been done to Buddy Musso. The first trial began on April 13, 1999. The defendant was J.D. O'Malley, Sue Basso's 23-year-old son. Prosecutors presented evidence of his direct participation in the beatings, his confession to police, and his role in helping dispose of Buddy's body. O'Malley took the witness stand in his own defense. He described a lifetime of abuse and control at his mother's hands. He explained that he had lived a fantasy life as a special operations soldier, wearing military clothing day and night, following his mother's orders without question. He testified that his mother had pressured him to participate in the killing. "I didn't know what else to do," O'Malley told the jury. "I was scared of my mother." The jury convicted O'Malley of capital murder and sentenced him to life in prison. It was the first conviction in the case, and it established the pattern that would follow. Those who cooperated and testified truthfully received prison sentences, while the mastermind would face death. Later that month, Craig Aarons went on trial. He admitted hitting Buddy with a baseball bat and a vacuum hose. Like O'Malley, he claimed that Sue Basso was the one in charge, the one who directed the violence. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to 60 years in prison. In May, Bernice Aarons Miller and Terrence Singleton were tried together. Both admitted their roles in the beatings. Both pointed to Sue Basso and J.D. O'Malley as the primary assailants. Bernice was convicted of murder and received 80 years. Singleton was convicted of capital murder and received life in prison. Hope Aarons' trial in June ended with a hung jury. Prosecutors then offered her a plea bargain: plead guilty to murder, testify against Sue Basso, and receive a 20-year sentence. Hope accepted the deal. Her testimony would be crucial in the final trial. By the time Sue Basso's trial began in July 1999, 4 of her co-defendants had been convicted and 1 had pleaded guilty. All 5 had testified that Sue was the leader, the organizer, the one who directed the torture and planned the murder. The case against her was overwhelming. But Sue Basso had one more card to play. When she appeared in court, she looked nothing like the 300-pound woman who had jumped on Buddy Musso until his ribs broke. She had lost more than 160 pounds. She weighed only 140 pounds and sat in a wheelchair. She claimed to be paralyzed from a beating she had received from Harris County jailers. She claimed to have mental problems. She claimed to be blind. She spoke in a high-pitched, squeaky voice like a little girl. She said she had regressed to her childhood due to psychological trauma. She appeared unkempt and confused, sometimes seeming not to pay attention to the proceedings. The judge ordered a competency hearing. A court-appointed psychiatrist examined Basso and concluded that she was faking. Judge Keel agreed and ruled that Basso was competent to stand trial. The performance had failed. Sue Basso would face justice for what she had done. Sue Basso's trial proceeded in July 1999 despite her theatrical displays of disability. She was wheeled into court daily, appearing confused and detached, but the prosecution saw through her act. Prosecutors Colleen Barnett and Denise Nassar methodically presented their case, introducing Basso's written confession, the life insurance policies naming her as beneficiary, and the fake will she had backdated on her computer. Hope Aarons testified against Basso, describing how the 300-pound woman had jumped on Buddy, beaten him with various objects, and directed the others in their attacks. The medical examiner presented evidence of hundreds of injuries covering Buddy's body, and jurors viewed photographs documenting the horrific results of 5 days of torture. During the punishment phase, Basso's own daughter, Christiana Hardy, delivered devastating testimony. She described a childhood filled with physical beatings, sexual exploitation, and psychological torment, including being offered to maintenance workers as a child. Hardy explained how her mother had spent years molding JD into a weapon and personal servant. Psychologist Floyd Jennings characterized Basso as a manipulative complainer whom people instinctively wanted to avoid. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found no mitigating circumstances that warranted mercy. In October 1999, Judge Mary Lou Keel sentenced Basso to death by lethal injection. Basso wept and proclaimed her innocence as she was wheeled from the courtroom. Outside, Christiana Hardy told reporters she would celebrate with champagne when the execution was carried out. Following her conviction and sentencing, Sue Basso was transferred to the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, where all of the state's female death row inmates were housed. She arrived in late 1999, one of a small number of women awaiting execution in a state that carried out more death sentences than any other. Life on death row was monotonous and isolated. Inmates spent most of their time in single cells with limited interaction with other prisoners. They were allowed occasional visits, limited recreation time, and access to television and reading materials. For someone who had spent her life controlling others, the loss of freedom and power was its own form of punishment. Basso's health continued to deteriorate during her years of incarceration. She became morbidly obese again, her weight exceeding 260 pounds. She developed congestive heart failure, diabetes, and severe arthritis. She required a wheelchair for mobility. Eventually, she was transferred to the Estelle unit in Huntsville for specialized medical care. Her appeals wound through the Texas court system. Her attorneys argued that her trial had been unfair, that her mental illness had not been properly considered, that the evidence against her was flawed. They pointed to Dr. Paul Schroed, the assistant medical examiner who had performed Buddy's autopsy, and claimed his testimony was unreliable. In 2010, Dr. Todd Schroed was fired from his position as chief medical examiner in El Paso County for misrepresenting his credentials on his resume. That same year, an Ohio death sentence was commuted after questions arose about the accuracy of Schroed's testimony in that case. Basso's attorneys seized on this information, arguing that the conviction should be overturned. They also argued that no mitigating evidence had been presented at trial. The jury had not heard about Basso's abusive childhood, about the sexual assaults by relatives, about her documented history of mental illness and delusional thinking. The defense had requested funds to hire a nationally recognized mitigation expert named Mark Cunningham. But Judge Keel had denied the request. But appellate courts were unmoved. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals rejected her appeals. Federal courts rejected her habeas corpus petitions. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and no procedural error was significant enough to warrant a new trial. Meanwhile, the other defendants continued serving their sentences. J.D. O'Malley, Terrence Singleton, Bernice Aarons, and Craig Aarons remained behind bars. Hope Aarons, who had received the lightest sentence in exchange for her testimony, was released after serving her time. As the years passed, Basso's execution date was repeatedly scheduled and postponed. Texas had stopped using the 3-drug cocktail for lethal injections in 2012 due to pharmaceutical companies refusing to supply the drugs. The state switched to a single dose of pentobarbital, but even this proved difficult to obtain. Finally, in late 2013, an execution date was set, February 5, 2014. Sue Basso had spent nearly 15 years on death row. Now she would face one final legal battle over whether she was mentally competent to be executed. In December 2013, Sue Basso was wheeled into the 232nd District Court in Harris County for a competency hearing. Judge Mary Lou Keel, the same judge who had presided over her trial 15 years earlier, would determine whether Basso understood that she was going to be executed and why. Under Texas law, a prisoner cannot be executed if they are mentally incompetent. the standard requires that the condemned person understand the connection between their crime and their punishment. Basso's attorney, Winston Cochran Jr., argued that his client's delusional thinking made her incompetent for execution. To support this claim, Cochran called witnesses who testified about Basso's strange beliefs. She claimed that a nurse had tried to kill her by hiding a snake inside a hollowed-out Roy Rogers book. She said she was one of triplets who had been born in the office of a Catholic bishop. She claimed to have worked in the New York governor's office and to have had a personal relationship with former Governor Nelson Rockefeller. Basso herself testified from a hospital bed that had been wheeled into the courtroom. She acknowledged lying about parts of her background, admitting that she was not actually a triplet, had not worked for the governor, and had not had a relationship with Rockefeller. But she maintained that her mental state made her incapable of understanding the legal proceedings against her. She claimed to be paralyzed from the chest down as a result of the beating she said she had received from Harris County jailers years earlier. Medical records showed she actually suffered from a degenerative disease, not injuries from an assault. Prosecutors responded that Basso was a lifelong liar who had fabricated stories about herself throughout her life. The fake wedding announcement in the Houston Chronicle, with its claims of oil heiress status and convent training, demonstrated her pattern of elaborate deception. Her behavior at trial, with the little girl voice and claims of blindness, had already been judged to be an act by the court-appointed psychiatrist. In January 2014, Judge Keel ruled that Basso was competent to be executed. She understood that she had been convicted of murdering Buddy Musso. She understood that she was going to die for that crime. Her delusional statements were either fabrications or did not prevent her from grasping the basic reality of her situation. Cochran immediately appealed the ruling. On February 3, 2014, just 2 days before the scheduled execution, both the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals and the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Texas rejected the competency appeals. The execution would proceed. Cochran also filed a clemency petition with the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, asking them to commute Basso's sentence to life in prison or grant a 90-day reprieve. He cited the lack of mitigating evidence at trial, the questions about Dr. Schroed's testimony, and Basso's mental health history. The board denied the petition. Sue Basso would die on February 5, 2014. February 5, 2014 was a cold Wednesday in Huntsville, Texas. The Huntsville unit, where executions were carried out, had been the site of death since Texas resumed capital punishment in 1982. More than 500 people had been put to death within its walls, but only 4 of them had been women. Sue Basso would be the 5th. Texas had eliminated special last meal requests on death row in 2011, following an incident where a condemned inmate ordered a massive feast and then refused to eat any of it. Now prisoners received the same meal served to the rest of the unit. On her final day, Basso ate baked chicken, fish, boiled eggs, carrots, green beans, and sliced bread. As the execution hour approached, Basso's attorney made one last attempt to save her life. Winston Cochran filed an emergency petition with the United States Supreme Court, asking the justices to halt the execution and review her competency claims. The wait was tense. Executions in Texas were scheduled for 6 p.m., but they could be delayed if courts were still considering appeals. In some cases, stays had been granted with only minutes to spare. In others, the Supreme Court had allowed executions to proceed despite last-minute challenges. At approximately 5:15 p.m., about an hour before the scheduled execution, the Supreme Court rejected Basso's final appeal. There would be no stay. There would be no reprieve. The execution would proceed. Basso was moved to the execution chamber, a small room containing a gurney equipped with restraints. Witnesses filed into viewing rooms separated from the chamber by windows. On one side sat Basso's witnesses, her spiritual advisor and a friend. On the other side sat witnesses for the state. Among the state's witnesses was Colleen Barnett, the prosecutor who had tried Sue Basso 15 years earlier. Barnett had remained connected to the case all those years, believing that Buddy Musso deserved justice and that someone should be there to witness it being carried out. Sue Basso was strapped to the gurney. Intravenous lines were inserted into her arms. The single dose of pentobarbital was prepared. At 6:15 p.m., the warden asked if she had any final statement. Basso's response was brief. "No, sir." She appeared to be holding back tears. She was breathing heavily. Then she looked through the window at her spiritual advisor and friend. She managed a small smile. She mouthed a word that witnesses thought was bye. She nodded. The lethal injection began. The pentobarbital entered Sue Basso's bloodstream at 6:15 p.m. Central Standard Time. Pentobarbital is a barbiturate that causes unconsciousness within seconds and death within minutes by stopping respiration and cardiac function. It had become the standard drug for lethal injections in Texas after the traditional 3-drug protocol became unavailable. Basso was dressed in a white prison uniform. She lay on the gurney, strapped down, arms extended. As the drug took effect, she began to snore. The snoring was a common reaction to pentobarbital, a sign that the sedative was working and consciousness was fading. The snoring became less audible over the next few minutes. Then it stopped entirely. Sue Basso's chest ceased rising and falling. At 6:26 p.m., 11 minutes after the injection began, she was pronounced dead. She was 59 years old, the same age as her victim, Buddy Musso, had been when she killed him. After the execution, Colleen Barnett spoke to reporters. The case had stayed with her for 15 years, and she had made sure to be present at the end. "The case was special to me," Barnett said. "Buddy meant a lot to me. He was an innocent victim who only wanted a family. He wanted to marry Suzanne." Sue Basso became the 14th woman executed in the United States since the Supreme Court reinstated capital punishment in 1976. She was the 5th woman executed in Texas since the state resumed executions in 1982. She was the 510th person overall to be executed in Texas during that period, joining 505 men and 4 other women. She was the 2nd execution in Texas in 2014 and the first woman to be executed in the country since Kimberly McCarthy in June 2013, which had been Texas's 500th execution. The execution brought closure to a case that had haunted the Houston area for more than 15 years. Buddy Musso's murder had exposed the vulnerability of the mentally disabled, the failure of systems meant to protect them, and the capacity for ordinary people to commit extraordinary cruelty when led by someone without conscience. Subscribe for more true crime documentaries. Like and share if this story moved you.